The Real Life of Homer, Chapter 1, The Mystery of the Blind Poet. Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time and legend. Close your eyes and let me take you to ancient Greece, to an age when gods walked among mortals and heroes shaped destiny. This is the story of Homer, the blind poet whose words have echoed through nearly 3,000 years, the man who gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey, two of the greatest stories ever told. Yet Homer himself remains one of history's greatest mysteries. We begin our tale not with certainty, but with questions. Who was Homer? When did he live? Did he even exist at all? Or was Homer simply a name attached to ancient poems passed down through generations? These questions have puzzled scholars for centuries, and the answers remain elusive, hidden in the mists of time. But from the fragments we possess, from ancient testimony and literary analysis, from archaeology and oral tradition, we can piece together a story, a likely truth wrapped in possible legend. The ancient Greeks themselves believed Homer was real. They told stories of a blind poet who wandered from city to city, reciting epic poems from memory. 7 cities claimed to be his birthplace: Smyrna, Rhodes, Colophon, Salamis, Chios, Argos, and Athens. This multiplicity of claims suggests his fame was so great that every Greek city wanted to share in his glory. But it also highlights the uncertainty. If no one knew for certain where he was born, what else about him was unknown? Most ancient sources place Homer's life sometime between 850 and 750 BCE, during what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. This was a time after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, after the great Bronze Age palaces had fallen into ruin. Writing had been lost, or nearly so. The great linear B script of the Mycenaeans was gone, and the Greek alphabet was just being adopted from the Phoenicians. It was an age of oral culture, when knowledge was preserved not in books, but in memory, passed from generation to generation through carefully memorized poems and songs. In this world, poets held a sacred role. They were not merely entertainers, but the keepers of history, the preservers of cultural memory, the link to the heroic past. A skilled poet, called an oidos or bard, could recite thousands upon thousands of lines from memory, maintaining complex narratives across multiple nights of performance. These poets trained from childhood, learning not just specific poems, but techniques for composition and memorization that allowed them to recreate epic tales with each performance. Homer, if the traditions are to be believed, was the greatest of these bards. But he was also something more. Where other poets recited traditional tales with variations, Homer created, or at least finalized, 2 masterworks so perfect, so complete, that they became the standard against which all other poetry was measured. The Iliad, with its tale of Achilles' wrath during the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, following crafty Odysseus on his 10-year journey home, were more than just stories. They were the foundation of Greek culture, the texts that defined Greek identity, morality, and understanding of the divine. The ancient biographies of Homer, written centuries after his death, tell us he was blind. This detail appears so consistently that it likely contains truth. In the Odyssey itself, there appears a blind bard named Demodocus who sings of the Trojan War. Many scholars believe this character was Homer's self-portrait, a poet inserting himself into his own narrative. Blindness, in the ancient world, was often associated with prophetic or poetic insight. Blind seers like Tiresias could see truths hidden from those with physical sight. Perhaps Homer's blindness enhanced his inner vision, allowing him to see the stories with perfect clarity. But was there really one man named Homer who composed both epics? Or were the Iliad and Odyssey the work of different poets, or even multiple generations of poets, with Homer being a convenient name to attach to great works of unknown origin? This question, called the Homeric question, has occupied scholars since ancient times. Some argue that the poems are too different in style and focus to be by one author. Others point to consistent themes, repeated phrases, and unified artistic vision as proof of single authorship. Modern scholarship tends toward a middle view. There likely was a historical Homer, a master poet who lived sometime in the 8th century BCE. He inherited centuries of oral tradition about the Trojan War and the heroes of the Bronze Age. These stories had been passed down for perhaps 400 or 500 years, changing with each retelling, accumulating layers of detail and meaning. Homer took this raw material and shaped it into two coherent, powerful narratives. He may have been the first to perform them in the form we know, or he may have dictated them to early scribes as writing was just returning to Greece. What we can say with certainty is that the poems attributed to Homer are masterpieces. They combine vivid action with profound psychological insight. They explore themes of honor, fate, loyalty, and the relationship between mortals and gods. They contain moments of brutal violence and tender beauty, of cosmic scope and intimate detail. Whoever Homer was, he understood human nature deeply. He knew how to make characters live, how to make ancient wars matter to listeners separated from those events by centuries. The Greeks themselves revered Homer as almost divine. His poems were quoted constantly, memorized by every educated person, used to teach ethics and history. To know Homer was to be Greek. When Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world, he carried a copy of the Iliad with him, sleeping with it under his pillow. He saw himself as a new Achilles, living out a Homeric destiny. This was Homer's power. His stories did not just entertain, but shaped how people understood themselves and their world. So who was this mysterious poet? Let us construct a likely story from the fragments we possess, imagining the life of the man who gave us these immortal tales. We will follow the path suggested by tradition and scholarship, acknowledging uncertainty while seeking the human truth behind the legend. Chapter 2. A Child of Ionia. If we are to tell Homer's story, we must begin with a place. While 7 cities claimed him, the strongest tradition and the most compelling evidence point to Ionia, the western coast of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. This region, settled by Greeks centuries earlier, was a crossroads of cultures where Greek, Anatolian, and Near Eastern traditions mixed and mingled. The cities here, Smyrna, Ephesus, Colophon, Chios, were wealthy trading centers, sophisticated and cosmopolitan. Let us imagine, then, that Homer was born in or near Smyrna around 800 BCE. The name Homer, in Greek Homeros, may have meant hostage or one who accompanies, though its true etymology is uncertain. Perhaps it was not even his birth name, but a title he earned later, a name that stuck because of what it represented, one who accompanies heroes on their journeys, one who holds the past hostage in memory. His parents remain unknown to history. Ancient biographies gave them various names, Melis and Cretheus in some accounts, but these are likely inventions, stories created to fill the void of ignorance. What matters more is the world into which he was born. Ionia, in the 8th century BCE, was experiencing a cultural renaissance. The Greek alphabet was being adopted and refined. Trade was expanding. Cities were growing wealthy. And everywhere, people were hungry for stories of the heroic past, for connection to the great age of heroes that had ended centuries before. In this world, young Homer would have grown up surrounded by stories. Professional bards traveled from city to city, performing at festivals and private gatherings. They sang of the Trojan War, of Heracles and his labors, of the Argonauts and their quest for the Golden Fleece. These were not fixed texts, but flexible narratives, with each poet adding his own flourishes, emphasizing different aspects, adjusting the story for his audience. A skilled bard could perform for hours, even days, maintaining narrative coherence while adapting to the moment. If we accept the tradition of Homer's blindness, we must ask, was he born blind, or did he lose his sight later? Ancient sources differ. Some say he was blind from birth, others that illness or injury took his sight in childhood or youth. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. In the ancient world, many conditions that we can now treat led to blindness, infections, injuries, genetic conditions, a childhood illness, a fever that burned away his sight, might explain why Homer became a poet in the first place. For a blind child in ancient Greece, options were limited. He could not be a farmer or a warrior, a sailor or a craftsman. These professions required sight. But he could train his memory, develop his hearing, learn to recognize voices, and navigate by sound. And most importantly, he could learn poetry. In an oral culture, blindness was actually an advantage for a poet. Without the distraction of sight, he could focus entirely on sound, on rhythm, on the music of language. His mind could hold vast stores of memorized lines, patterns, and formulaic phrases that made composition and performance possible. We can imagine young Homer apprenticed to a master bard, perhaps when he was 7 or 8 years old. This teacher would have trained him in the traditional way. First, listening to performances repeatedly until the patterns became familiar. Then, memorizing key passages. Then learning the formulaic system that allowed poets to compose. The repeated epithets like swift-footed Achilles or gray-eyed Athena. The standard scenes of sacrifice or combat that could be adapted to any context. The metrical patterns that guided composition. The meter of Homeric epic is dactylic hexameter, a complex rhythm of long and short syllables. Each line contains 6 metrical units with specific patterns of emphasis. Mastering this meter required years of practice. Young Homer would have practiced composing in this rhythm until it became second nature, until he could create new lines spontaneously while maintaining perfect meter. This was the foundation of oral poetry, the ability to compose in real time while performing, drawing on a vast store of memorized patterns and themes. As Homer grew older, his talent would have become apparent. Perhaps his memory was exceptional, allowing him to hold more material than other students. Perhaps his sense of rhythm was superior, making his compositions flow more naturally. Perhaps he had an instinct for character and emotion that made his performances particularly moving. Whatever his gifts, they were recognized. A teacher sees potential and nurtures it. Homer would have been encouraged, given more advanced training, exposed to the best poets of the age. By his late teens or early 20s, Homer would have been ready to perform publicly. His first performances might have been at local festivals, where young poets competed for recognition. He would have recited traditional tales, demonstrating his mastery of the craft. If he performed well, he would be invited to larger gatherings, to the homes of wealthy patrons, eventually to religious festivals that attracted audiences from many cities. This was how a poet made his living, traveling from place to place, offering to perform in exchange for hospitality, gifts, and honor. A successful poet could live comfortably, respected and welcomed wherever he went. But it was also a precarious life. A poet who failed to please might go hungry. Competition was fierce, with many bards seeking limited opportunities. Only the most skilled survived and prospered. Homer's blindness, while an asset for memory and focus, also made travel more difficult. He would have needed companions, perhaps students or servants, to guide him along roads and through unfamiliar cities. Ancient sources sometimes mention a guide or assistant accompanying Homer on his journeys. This person would have been essential, not just for navigation, but for managing practical affairs, leaving Homer free to focus on his art. As Homer performed and traveled, he would have accumulated vast stores of knowledge. He heard stories from other poets, learning different versions of familiar tales. He observed human nature in all its varieties, from proud kings to humble servants. He visited many cities, saw different customs, encountered diverse beliefs. All of this fed into his poetry, giving it richness and depth. The Iliad and Odyssey are filled with precise details about aristocratic life, warfare, seafaring, domestic customs. Homer knew these things because he had seen them, or had learned from those who had. But Homer was not just a performer of traditional tales. Something in him sought to create, to take the inherited stories and shape them into something new, something perfect. Perhaps this ambition grew gradually as he refined his performances over years. Perhaps it struck him suddenly, a vision of how the Trojan War story could be told in a new way, focusing not on the whole war but on a few crucial weeks, exploring the character of Achilles in unprecedented depth. However it began, Homer was becoming not just a bard, but a true poet, an artist who would transcend his medium. Chapter 3. The Oral Tradition. To understand Homer's achievement, we must understand the world of oral poetry from which he emerged. This was not a literate culture where poets wrote their works down. This was a living tradition where stories existed only in performance, where each recitation was a creative act, where memory and improvisation merged seamlessly. The poems Homer inherited were centuries old. The Trojan War itself, if it occurred, probably happened around 1200 BCE, during the late Bronze Age. By Homer's time, 400 or 500 years had passed. The war had become legend, and with each generation, the stories had changed. New details were added, others forgotten. Heroes became more heroic, events more dramatic. The historical kernel, if any remained, was buried under layers of myth and cultural meaning. Yet certain elements persisted across all versions. The names of major heroes, Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Hector, remained constant. The basic story of a war over Helen, wife of Menelaus, stolen by Paris of Troy, was fixed. Key events like the death of Achilles, the Trojan horse, the fall of Troy, were essential elements no poet could change. These were the structure on which individual poets built their performances. But within this framework, poets had enormous flexibility. They could expand or compress scenes. They could emphasize different characters or themes. They could add speeches, elaborate on emotions, include or exclude minor episodes. Two poets telling the same basic story might produce performances that differed in thousands of details while maintaining the essential narrative. This was the nature of oral tradition: unity in diversity, stability in flux. The key to this system was the use of formulaic language. Homeric poetry is filled with repeated phrases: rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, swift-footed Achilles. These are not mere ornamentation, but structural elements that made oral composition possible. When a poet needed to describe dawn, he used the traditional formula. When he needed to mention Achilles, he had a stock epithet that fit the meter. These formulas allowed a poet to compose rapidly, in performance, without awkward pauses or broken rhythms. Modern scholars, particularly Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the 20th century, studied living oral traditions in Yugoslavia and elsewhere, discovering how oral poets functioned. They found that illiterate singers could perform epic poems of thousands of lines, improvising as they went, maintaining narrative coherence while adapting to audience reaction. The poems existed not as fixed texts, but as fluid traditions that each singer recreated with each performance. Homer existed in this tradition. He learned the formulas, the standard scenes, the narrative patterns. He could compose in real time, building his performance from traditional building blocks. But Homer also did something more. He used these traditional tools to create poems of unprecedented sophistication and artistic unity. The Iliad and Odyssey are not mere traditional tales, but carefully structured works of art, with themes that develop across thousands of lines, with character arcs that show profound psychological insight, with symbolic patterns that unify the whole. Consider the structure of the Iliad. The poem does not tell the whole Trojan War, but focuses on a brief period, the wrath of Achilles and its consequences. The poem begins with Achilles withdrawing from battle after being dishonored by Agamemnon. It follows the disasters that befall the Greeks without their greatest warrior. It climaxes with Achilles returning to battle to avenge his friend Patroclus, killing Hector. And it ends not with victory, but with a profound meditation on mortality and compassion, as Achilles returns Hector's body to King Priam. This structure is too perfect to be accidental. Someone designed it, choosing to tell this particular story in this particular way. That someone was almost certainly Homer. He took the traditional stories of the Trojan War and extracted this central thread, developing it with unprecedented depth. The Iliad explores the psychology of rage, of honor, of friendship, of mortality. It questions heroic values even as it celebrates them. It makes us sympathize with both Greeks and Trojans, showing the humanity of all warriors in this terrible conflict. The Odyssey is equally sophisticated. It tells the story of Odysseus's return home after the Trojan War. But the narrative structure is complex and innovative. The poem begins, in medias res, with Odysseus trapped on Calypso's island. We then follow his son Telemachus searching for news of his father. Only in the middle of the poem does Odysseus himself narrate his adventures, the Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. The final third depicts Odysseus's return to Ithaca and his vengeance on the suitors who have invaded his home. This structure, with its flashbacks and multiple perspectives, is remarkably sophisticated for oral poetry. It suggests a level of planning and artistic control that goes beyond traditional oral composition. Someone conceived this narrative as a whole, seeing how the parts would fit together, how themes would develop, how the audience's understanding would deepen as the story unfolded. This level of artistry points to a singular creative intelligence. Homer. But could one poet really have composed such vast works? The Iliad contains about 15,700 lines, the Odyssey about 12,100. That's nearly 28,000 lines of poetry, all in perfect dactylic hexameter. Could one human mind hold all this, compose all this, perform all this? The answer, based on studies of oral poets in other cultures, is yes. but barely. It represents the absolute peak of what oral tradition could achieve, the work of an exceptional genius operating at the limits of human capacity. Homer likely composed these poems over many years. He probably performed different episodes at different times, gradually refining them. The Iliad might have taken shape first, its focused narrative achieving perfection. The Odyssey might have followed, building on techniques Homer developed in the earlier work. Or perhaps he worked on both simultaneously, moving between them as inspiration and opportunity allowed. We cannot know the process, only the result. Two masterpieces that represent the culmination of a centuries-old tradition. As Homer perfected these poems through repeated performances, they would have become famous. Other poets would have heard him and tried to recreate his versions. Audiences would have requested his particular telling of these stories. Perhaps he trained students, passing on his compositions to a new generation. In this way, the Homeric poems became fixed in the tradition, no longer fluid but definite, no longer improvised but memorized. They became texts in all but name, preserved in memory with remarkable fidelity. This was Homer's genius. He took the flexibility of oral tradition and created works so perfect that they transcended that tradition. He made poems so good that people wanted to preserve them exactly, not as general stories but as specific words in specific order. In doing so, he anticipated writing, creating oral texts that demanded to be fixed and preserved. When writing did come to Greece, it was perhaps inevitable that the Homeric poems were among the first things written down, too valuable to risk losing to the vagaries of memory. Chapter 4. The Wandering Bard. Homer's life, if we follow the traditional accounts, was one of constant travel. As a professional bard, he would have moved from city to city, from island to island, seeking patrons and audiences. This wandering life shaped both his art and his understanding of the world. He was a poet of journeys, and he lived a journey himself. In ancient Greece, poets traveled to religious festivals, which were major social and cultural events. The Panionian festival, celebrating the unity of the Ionian Greeks, would have been a natural venue for Homer. So would the great festivals at Delos, sacred to Apollo. At these gatherings, thousands might attend, and successful performances could make a poet famous across the Greek world. Competition was fierce, with many poets seeking recognition, but the rewards for success were substantial: fame, gifts, and invitations to perform at wealthy homes. We can imagine Homer arriving at a festival, guided by his assistant, making his way to the performance area. Perhaps he played a lyre or kithara, though the poems themselves would have been recited or chanted rather than sung. He would announce his theme: tonight, the wrath of Achilles, or the adventures of Odysseus. And then he would begin, his trained voice carrying across the crowd, his memory unfailing, his performance bringing ancient heroes to life. The audience would have been diverse: aristocrats who saw themselves reflected in the heroes, common people who loved the stories, fellow poets who evaluated technique, foreigners who wanted to understand Greek culture. Homer would have adjusted his performance for the audience, perhaps elaborating on battle scenes for a warrior crowd, emphasizing domestic scenes for a more mixed audience, including topical references that made the ancient story relevant to contemporary concerns. But festival performances were perhaps the lesser part of Homer's life. More important were invitations to aristocratic homes, where a poet might stay for days or weeks, entertaining the household and their guests. These extended visits gave Homer opportunity to develop relationships with powerful patrons, to observe aristocratic life closely, and to perform longer sections of his epics, building narrative momentum across multiple nights. In the Odyssey, we see how such performances worked. The bard Demodocus performs in the palace of King Alcinous, singing episodes from the Trojan War. His audience weeps at the vivid portrayal of events many have experienced. Later, Odysseus himself narrates his adventures, holding his audience spellbound through the night. This is surely Homer describing the reality of his own profession, the poet as honored guest, his stories commanding rapt attention, his art touching hearts and minds. Homer's travels took him across the Greek world. He would have visited the great cities of Ionia, Miletus, Ephesus, Colophon. Perhaps he crossed to the islands Chios, which later claimed him as native son, Samos, Rhodes. He might have traveled to mainland Greece, to Athens or Thebes or Argos, each city adding to his store of knowledge and experience. Some traditions even have him traveling to Italy or Sicily, though this seems less likely. Everywhere he went, Homer observed. He noted how different cities were governed, how their customs varied, how their dialects differed. He listened to local legends and incorporated elements into his poems. The Iliad's catalogue of ships, listing the contingents that sailed to Troy, reflects real geography and political relationships of Homer's time, suggesting he knew these places personally or through reliable informants. The Odyssey's fantastical locations might have been inspired by sailors' tales heard in port cities, real places transformed by imagination into mythical realms. Homer's blindness made him dependent on others for descriptions of visual details, yet his poems are remarkably vivid. He describes armor and weapons with precision, ships and chariots with technical accuracy, palaces and temples with architectural knowledge. How did a blind man know these things? Through touch, through detailed descriptions from others, through a lifetime of careful listening and questioning. His blindness forced him to pay attention in ways sighted people might not, to create mental images from verbal descriptions, to understand the world through all senses except sight. The wandering life was not easy. Roads were dangerous, infested with bandits. Sea travel was hazardous, with storms and pirates threatening ships. A blind man was particularly vulnerable, dependent on his guides for safety. Yet Homer persevered, driven by the need to perform, to share his art, to make his living through poetry. He was, in his way, like Odysseus, a traveler facing hardships, using wit and art to survive, always seeking home, yet always moving onward. Some ancient accounts suggest Homer eventually settled in Chios, finding a home base from which he made shorter journeys. The island of Chios maintained a guild of poets called the Homeridae, the sons of Homer, who claimed to preserve and perform his works. Whether Homer actually lived his later years in Chios or the Homeridae simply adopted him as their founder is uncertain. But the tradition suggests that eventually the wandering poet found some stability, a place to train students and refine his art. In his later years, as his fame grew, Homer may have needed to travel less. Patrons might have come to him, inviting him to their cities with generous offers. His students could have performed his works, spreading his reputation even when he could not travel himself. Yet the wandering life had shaped him irreversibly. The Odyssey, his great poem of homecoming, is also a poem about the beauty and terror of travel, about encountering the strange and the wonderful. It is the work of a man who had spent his life on the road, who knew both the longing for home and the thrill of discovering new places. Homer's travels also gave him a pan-Hellenic perspective. He was not bound to one city's interests or prejudices. He could see the Greek world as a whole, recognizing common culture beneath local variations. This breadth of vision is evident in his poems, which celebrate heroes from many cities, which treat Trojans with as much sympathy as Greeks, which question narrow loyalties in favor of universal human values. The wandering poet became, through his travels, a poet of all Greeks, giving them a common cultural foundation that would help define Greek identity for centuries. Chapter 5. The Making of the Iliad. Let us turn now to Homer's greatest creation, the Iliad. How did this masterpiece come to be? What inspired Homer to tell this particular story in this particular way? The process likely spanned years, perhaps decades, as Homer refined his vision of the Trojan War into a perfect artistic statement. The Trojan War was already ancient legend by Homer's time. Countless poets had told stories of the conflict, the 10-year siege, the great duels, the deaths of heroes, the fall of Troy. Audiences knew the overall narrative. They knew Achilles would die from an arrow to his heel, that Troy would fall to a wooden horse, that Odysseus would wander for 10 years before reaching home. These were givens, fixed points that no poet could change. So Homer made a crucial decision. He would not tell the whole war. Instead, he would focus on a brief period, perhaps a few weeks, centering on the anger of Achilles. The poem begins with a quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon over a captured woman. Agamemnon, as commander, takes Achilles' prize, dishonoring the greatest Greek warrior. Achilles withdraws from battle in rage, taking his Myrmidon soldiers with him. This is the setup, and everything flows from it. Why did Homer choose this focus? Because it allowed him to explore profound themes. The Iliad is not really about the Trojan War, but about human nature, pride, honor, rage, friendship, mortality. By narrowing his scope, Homer could develop these themes with unprecedented depth. We watch Achilles wrestle with his anger, see how pride and wounded honor drive him to decisions that cost the lives of friends and enemies alike. We see him transformed by grief when his beloved friend Patroclus is killed. We witness his terrible vengeance against Hector, and then his transcendent moment of compassion when he returns Hector's body to King Priam. The structure of the Iliad is masterful. The first book establishes the conflict and Achilles' withdrawal. Books 2 to 7 show the Greeks struggling without Achilles, with various heroes trying to fill his absence. Books 8 to 15 depict the Trojans, led by Hector, driving the Greeks back to their ships, nearly burning their fleet. Book 16 shows Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, borrowing Achilles' armor and entering battle to save the Greeks, only to be killed by Hector. Books 17 to 22 show Achilles' grief transforming into fury, his return to battle, and his slaughter of Trojans culminating in killing Hector. Books 23 to 24 show the funeral games for Patroclus and Achilles' meeting with Priam, ending on a note of shared humanity, transcending enmity. This structure did not emerge accidentally. Homer must have planned it, seeing how the parts would fit together, how the emotional arc would develop, how themes would be introduced and then resolved. This level of artistic control suggests composition over time, with Homer revising and refining his material through multiple performances. The characters in the Iliad are Homer's great achievement. Achilles is complex, the greatest warrior, nearly divine, yet deeply human in his pride and grief. Hector is noble, defending his city and family, yet doomed by fate. Agamemnon is powerful but flawed, his poor leadership costing Greek lives. Odysseus is cunning and resourceful. Ajax is strong but inflexible. Diomedes is brave but understands mortal limitations. Each character is distinct, psychologically real, memorable. Homer also gives voice to Trojans and Greeks equally. We spend time in Troy, meeting Hector's wife Andromache and their infant son, seeing the humanity of those defending their city. We hear King Priam's grief for his children killed by Achilles. We understand that war destroys both sides, that there are no real winners, only survivors and corpses. This balanced perspective is unusual in ancient poetry, where enemies were typically demonized. Homer's sympathy extends to all humans caught in war's horror. The gods in the Iliad are fascinating. They take sides, interfere with battles, save favored heroes from death. Yet they also seem arbitrary, petty, driven by personal grudges rather than justice. The gods care about humans, but also toy with them. This creates a world where human effort matters, but fate, ultimately, determines outcomes. Achilles knows he is fated to die young if he fights at Troy, yet he chooses glory over long life. This choice gives his story tragic power. He is doomed, but his doom is self-chosen, embraced as the price of eternal fame. Homer's language in the Iliad is powerful and precise. His similes are justly famous, comparing warriors to lions, storms to battles, fallen heroes to felled trees. These similes provide moments of reflection in the action, connecting the heroic world to the natural world, making the ancient story accessible. His battle scenes are visceral. Spears penetrate bronze armor and pierce lungs. Swords split skulls. Blood flows like rivers. Death is not glorified, but shown in its terrible reality. Yet the Iliad also contains moments of profound beauty. The meeting of Hector and Andromache in Book 6, where they discuss war and fate and family. The embassy to Achilles in Book 9, where old Phoenix appeals to Achilles' better nature. The funeral games in Book 23, where competition replaces combat. And especially Book 24, the meeting of Achilles and Priam, enemy meeting enemy. Both grieving, both recognizing their shared humanity. Priam kisses the hand of the man who killed his son, and Achilles weeps with the father of the man he murdered. It is one of the most powerful scenes in all literature. How did Homer compose this masterpiece? Probably over many years, performing different episodes at different times, gradually fitting them into a coherent whole. He might have started with individual scenes, the quarrel, Patroclus' death, the duel with Hector, the meeting with Priam. As he performed these scenes repeatedly, he refined them, added connections, developed themes. Eventually, he saw how they could form a complete poem unified by the theme of Achilles' wrath and its consequences. The Iliad represents the peak of oral poetic achievement. It is the longest and most complex poem that could exist, in oral form, held in one mind, and performed from memory. That one man could conceive and execute such a work seems almost superhuman. Yet Homer did it, creating a poem that has moved audiences for nearly 3,000 years. A poem that still speaks to us today about honor, loss, rage, compassion, and mortality. Chapter 6. The Creating of the Odyssey. After the Iliad, Homer created another masterpiece, the Odyssey. While the Iliad is a poem of war, the Odyssey is a poem of peace, or rather, of the struggle to return to peace after war. While the Iliad focuses on Achilles' rage, the Odyssey follows Odysseus' cunning and endurance. While the Iliad is set in one location over a few weeks, the Odyssey ranges across the Mediterranean over 10 years. The poems complement each other, offering different perspectives on the heroic age. The Odyssey is, on the surface, an adventure story, the travels of Odysseus as he tries to reach home after the Trojan War. But like the Iliad, it is much more. It is a meditation on identity, loyalty, civilization, and what it means to be human. It asks, who are we when stripped of home and social roles? How do we maintain ourselves through adversity? What is worth fighting for? Homer's decision to focus on Odysseus was inspired. Of all the Greek heroes at Troy, Odysseus is the most interesting from a narrative perspective. Achilles is the greatest warrior, but his story is tragic and straightforward. Odysseus is complicated, a hero defined by intelligence rather than strength, a man of many tricks and stratagems, a survivor who uses his wits to overcome challenges. He is in many ways more like us than Achilles, not a demigod, but a clever human navigating a dangerous world. The structure of the Odyssey is remarkably sophisticated. The poem begins not with Odysseus, but with his son Telemachus, now grown, searching for news of his missing father. This opening establishes the situation in Ithaca. Penelope besieged by suitors who consume Odysseus's wealth and pressure her to remarry, believing Odysseus dead. We care about the homecoming because we see what Odysseus is coming home to, the stakes of his return. Only in Book 5 do we meet Odysseus, trapped on Calypso's island, weeping as he stares toward home. The goddess Calypso offers him immortality if he stays with her, but Odysseus refuses. He would rather be mortal in Ithaca than immortal anywhere else. This choice is crucial. Odysseus choosing mortality, choosing humanity, choosing home over paradise. It defines his character and the poem's themes. Books 9 to 12 are Odysseus's narrative of his adventures, the land of the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops Polyphemus, the Wind King Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, the witch Circe, the journey to the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, and the sun god's cattle. These adventures, told by Odysseus himself at a feast, allow Homer to showcase the hero's storytelling ability while also raising questions. Is Odysseus a reliable narrator? Does he exaggerate? These are sophisticated narrative techniques, showing Homer's artistic ambition. The final third of the poem depicts Odysseus's return to Ithaca and his reclaiming of home. He arrives disguised as a beggar, testing loyalties, planning revenge. The poem builds slowly to the climax, Odysseus revealing himself and slaughtering the suitors, then reuniting with Penelope. This domestic warfare, fought with cunning rather than armies, provides a different kind of heroism, one based on patience, planning, and perseverance. The Odyssey is often compared unfavorably to the Iliad by those who prefer martial epic to domestic adventure. But this misses Homer's achievement. The Odyssey is deliberately different, exploring aspects of experience the Iliad did not address. It asks, what happens after the war? How do warriors return to civilian life? How do families reunite after long separation? What scars do war and trauma leave? Odysseus in the Odyssey is not simply a hero, but a man struggling with his experiences. When he meets his mother's shade in the underworld, he tries 3 times to embrace her, and cannot. Ghosts cannot be held. When the bard Demodocus sings of the Trojan War, Odysseus weeps, the memories too painful. When he finally reveals himself to Penelope, their reunion is complicated. 20 years have passed, and both have changed. Homer is showing the psychological reality of homecoming, the difficulty of reintegration after trauma. The monsters Odysseus faces can be read as externalized psychological challenges. The Lotus Eaters represent forgetfulness and the temptation to abandon goals. The Cyclops represents uncivilized brutality that Odysseus must outwit. Circe represents seductive luxury that almost makes Odysseus forget his purpose. The Sirens represent the allure of perfect knowledge. Scylla and Charybdis represent impossible choices where loss is inevitable. Each challenge tests a different aspect of Odysseus's character. The poem is also deeply concerned with civilization and its discontents. Odysseus encounters many societies: the civilized Phaeacians who help him, the barbarous Cyclopes who know no law, the Laestrygonians who practice cannibalism. He sees the limits of civilization at home, where the suitors abuse hospitality. The poem asks, what makes a good society? What are the obligations of host to guest, of citizens to rulers? These questions would have resonated with Homer's Greek audiences, living in their own newly forming city-states. Penelope deserves special attention. She is often overshadowed by Odysseus, but she is crucial to the poem's meaning. While Odysseus wanders, Penelope waits, but her waiting is active, not passive. She tricks the suitors for years, weaving and unweaving a shroud to delay remarriage. When Odysseus returns, she tests him to ensure he is truly her husband. She is Odysseus's match in cunning, and their reunion is between equals. Homer gives Penelope agency and intelligence, making her a hero of her own story. The ending of the Odyssey is controversial. After the slaughter of the suitors, the poem continues with scenes of reunion, revenge, and finally, peace, brokered by Athena. Some ancient scholars believed the poem should end earlier, that these final scenes were later additions. But the extended ending serves important purposes. It shows the consequences of Odysseus's violence, the necessity of healing and reconciliation, the return to social order. The poem begins with disorder and ends with order restored, completing the thematic arc. How long did Homer take to compose the Odyssey? Probably years, perhaps performing it in episodes before assembling it into a complete work. The poem is slightly shorter than the Iliad, but equally complex in structure and theme. Its sophisticated narrative techniques, flashbacks, unreliable narration, multiple perspectives, suggest confidence born of experience. Many scholars believe the Odyssey was composed later than the Iliad, representing Homer's mature style, though certainty is impossible. Together, the Iliad and Odyssey present a complete vision of the heroic world. The Iliad shows the glory and horror of war, the price of honor, the inevitability of death. The Odyssey shows what comes after, the struggle to return to peace, the value of home, the triumph of cunning and endurance. They are complementary masterpieces, each complete in itself, but together forming a unified statement about human experience. Chapter 7. The Living Words. Homer's poems were not silent texts on papyrus, but living performances, spoken and heard, experienced in community. To understand Homer, we must understand how his poems functioned in ancient Greek society, how they were performed and received, how they shaped culture and consciousness. In Homer's time, and for centuries after, most people encountered the Iliad and Odyssey not by reading but by listening. A rhapsode, a professional performer, would recite the poems at festivals, in aristocratic homes, in public gatherings. These performances were major cultural events, drawing large audiences and lasting for hours or even days. The complete Iliad might require 3 full days of continuous performance, the Odyssey slightly less. The rhapsode performed dramatically, using vocal variety, gestures, and emotional expression to bring the text to life. When Achilles raged, the rhapsode's voice thundered. When Priam wept, the performer might weep himself. The audience was not passive but engaged, reacting audibly, sometimes interrupting with comments or questions. This was participatory culture, where the boundary between performer and audience was fluid. The meter of Homeric verse, dactylic hexameter, was crucial to these performances. The rhythm carried listeners along, making long passages easier to follow and remember. The meter also signaled to the audience that this was elevated language, different from ordinary speech, worthy of attention and respect. Modern readers often find the meter monotonous, but for ancient listeners, trained from childhood to hear these rhythms, the meter was probably experienced as natural and even necessary. The repeated epithets and formulaic phrases that modern readers sometimes find tedious served important functions in oral performance. They gave the audience landmarks, familiar phrases that oriented them in the narrative. They also gave the performer brief mental breaks, moments when he could speak familiar words while thinking ahead to the next section. And they created a sense of timelessness, of stories belonging to tradition rather than individual invention. Homer's similes, those extended comparisons that paused the action, were particularly important in performance. After intense battle scenes or emotional moments, a simile provided breathing space, allowing audience and performer to reset before continuing. The similes also connected the heroic world to the listener's lived experience. When Achilles is compared to a lion or a storm, when warriors fall like trees, the audience could visualize these familiar phenomena, making the ancient story present and real. The poems were memorized by countless Greeks. Educated men could recite long passages from memory, quoting Homer in conversation, using his verses to illustrate points or demonstrate learning. Homer became, in effect, the Greek Bible, a text everyone knew, that shaped moral thinking, that provided common reference points. To be Greek, in many ways, was to know Homer. Schools used Homer to teach literacy, morality, and cultural values. Boys learning to read and write practiced with Homeric texts. They analyzed the poems for ethical lessons, the dangers of pride, the importance of hospitality, the duty to one's community. Heroes became models to emulate or cautionary examples to avoid. Achilles demonstrated both the glory of heroism and the destructiveness of rage. Odysseus showed the value of intelligence and perseverance. Hector embodied duty and love of family. The poems also shaped Greek religious ideas. Homer's gods were the gods Greeks worshipped, but Homer gave them personalities, relationships, and stories that became canonical. Zeus, the father of gods, Hera, the jealous wife, Athena, the wise counselor, Poseidon, the tempestuous sea god. These characterizations came largely from Homer. His poems explained how gods related to humans, why they deserved worship, how one should behave toward them. Theology and poetry were inseparable. Homer's influence extended beyond literature to visual arts. Vase painters depicted scenes from the Iliad and Odyssey, making the stories visual. Sculptors created statues of Homeric heroes. Architects designed temples with friezes showing Trojan War episodes. The poems became a shared visual vocabulary, with everyone recognizing Achilles dragging Hector's body, Odysseus blinding the Cyclops, the Trojan horse entering the city. But the poems also provoked criticism and philosophical inquiry. Xenophanes, and later Plato, questioned Homer's portrayal of gods as petty and immoral. If gods were models of virtue, why did Homer show them lying, cheating, and fighting? Some philosophers argued Homer's poems were dangerous, teaching wrong lessons about divinity and morality. Others defended Homer by reading the poems allegorically, arguing that the stories contained hidden philosophical truths beneath their literal surface. This debate about Homer's meaning and value continued throughout antiquity. Some saw him as the educator of Greece, the ultimate authority on all subjects. Others saw him as a brilliant storyteller whose work should not be taken as literal truth. The debate itself testifies to Homer's importance. He mattered enough to argue about. His poems were not mere entertainment, but foundational texts that shaped how Greeks understood themselves and their world. Over time, the text of Homer became somewhat standardized. In the 6th century BCE, the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus allegedly established an official text of the Homeric poems for performance at festivals. This helped reduce variation between different performers' versions, though complete standardization was probably impossible in an oral culture. Later scholars in Alexandria, the great library city, produced critical editions, comparing manuscripts and trying to determine the original text. Their work established the text we have today, though questions about textual accuracy remain. The transition from oral performance to written text changed how Homer was experienced. Reading allowed individual engagement, private contemplation, detailed analysis. But something was lost: the communal experience, the dramatic performance, the living quality of oral poetry. The written Iliad and Odyssey are like musical scores. They preserve the compositions, but a score is not a performance. We can read Homer's words, but we cannot hear his voice, see his performance, experience the poems as his audiences did. Yet Homer's words endure. They have survived nearly 3 millennia, copied by scribes, translated into hundreds of languages, read by billions of people. They remain vivid, powerful, moving. Characters created almost 3,000 years ago still feel real, their emotions genuine, their struggles universal. This is Homer's ultimate achievement. He created art that transcends its original context, that speaks to human experience across all barriers of time, culture, and language. Chapter 8. The Question of Authorship. For nearly 2 millennia, no one seriously questioned Homer's authorship of the Iliad and Odyssey. The ancient Greeks accepted that a blind poet named Homer composed both epics. Medieval and Renaissance scholars did the same. But beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, critical scholars began to ask difficult questions, sparking a controversy that continues today: the Homeric question. The first doubts arose from close reading of the poems. Scholars noticed inconsistencies, characters who appear and disappear without explanation, plot threads that seem forgotten, geographical descriptions that contradict each other. The poems sometimes seem to reflect different historical periods, with Bronze Age weapons mentioned alongside Iron Age customs. The language itself was a puzzle, a mixture of dialects that no Greek ever actually spoke. How could one author produce such inconsistencies? In 1795, Friedrich August Wolff published Prolegomena ad Homerum, arguing that Homer could not have composed the epics as unified works because writing did not exist in his time. Without writing, Wolff argued, no poet could create and preserve such long, complex poems. Therefore, the Iliad and Odyssey must be compilations of shorter songs by many poets, later stitched together. Homer was not an author, but a collection of traditions attributed to a legendary figure. This theory, called the analytical approach, gained many adherents. Scholars dissected the poems, identifying supposed layers of composition, contradictions indicating multiple authorship, interpolations added by later poets. Some claim to detect 10 or 20 different poets contributing to the Iliad. The poems were analyzed into oblivion, reduced to patchwork quilts, with no unifying artistic vision. But other scholars resisted this dismemberment. They pointed to the poem's artistic unity, the careful structure, the development of themes across thousands of lines. Could such unity emerge accidentally from multiple authors working independently? The Unitarian scholars argued for single authorship, claiming the supposed inconsistencies were either insignificant or misunderstood. One brilliant poet, they insisted, composed each epic. The debate deadlocked until the 20th century brought new evidence from unexpected sources. Milman Parry, an American classicist, studied oral poetry in Yugoslavia, discovering living traditions of illiterate poets who composed epic poems thousands of lines long without writing. These guslar singers memorized vast amounts of traditional material and improvised performances using formulaic techniques. Parry demonstrated that oral composition could produce exactly the features scholars had attributed to multiple authorship: repeated phrases, flexible narratives, dialectical mixtures. Parry's work, continued by his student Albert Lord, revolutionized Homeric studies. It showed that one highly talented oral poet could compose poems as long and complex as the Iliad and Odyssey. The formulas were not signs of primitive composition, but sophisticated tools enabling oral creation. The inconsistencies were natural features of oral tradition, not evidence of multiple authorship. Homer could have existed as tradition claimed, one blind bard who mastered oral technique and created two masterpieces. But Parry's work also complicated matters. If Homer composed orally, using traditional formulas and themes, how much was truly his creation versus inherited tradition? Was Homer an author in our sense, or merely a particularly skilled transmitter of collective tradition? Modern scholars distinguish between Homer the poet and Homeric poetry, acknowledging that the poems contain centuries of accumulated tradition, even if one man gave them final form. The question of whether the same poet composed both epics remains contentious. The Iliad and Odyssey differ significantly in tone, structure, and themes. The Iliad is tragic, focused, concerned with honor and mortality. The Odyssey is more optimistic, episodic, interested in identity and homecoming. The Iliad's language seems older, more formulaic. The Odyssey shows more innovation, more narrative sophistication. Could one poet compose both? Some scholars argue the differences prove separate authorship, perhaps separated by generations. Others claim the differences reflect one poet's development, with the Odyssey showing Homer's mature style. Still others suggest Homer composed the Iliad, while a student or colleague composed the Odyssey in Homer's style. The debate continues, with passionate advocates on all sides. Archaeology has added fascinating evidence to the discussion. Excavations at Troy revealed that a significant city existed in Bronze Age Anatolia, was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and was finally abandoned around 1180 BCE. This roughly matches Homer's Trojan War timeline, though archaeological evidence cannot prove Homer's stories true. The palace culture described in Homer, with kings, warriors, and elaborate feasts, does match what we know of Bronze Age Greece from other sources, but Homer also describes things that did not exist in the Bronze Age, cremation burial, for instance, which became common only later, and he omits things that did exist: the palace bureaucracies, the linear B script, the precise details of Bronze Age warfare. Homer seems to remember the Bronze Age through a veil of centuries, preserving some authentic details while transforming others through tradition's filter. Modern scholarly consensus, if such exists, suggests something like this. There was a historical Homer, a poet of exceptional genius who lived in the 8th century BCE. He inherited centuries of oral tradition about the Trojan War and its aftermath. He used traditional formulas and themes, but combined them with unprecedented artistry to create two coherent, unified epics. He may have dictated these poems to scribes as writing returned to Greece, fixing in text what had been fluid in performance. Or his students preserved his performances through memorization, eventually committing them to writing. Whether Homer composed both epics or only one remains uncertain. Whether he was completely blind or merely visually impaired, whether he came from Chios or Smyrna, whether he trained students who preserved his work, these questions may never be definitively answered. But the existence of a poet called Homer, who shaped the epics into essentially their current form, seems more plausible than the alternative theories requiring elaborate conspiracies of multiple poets, accidentally creating artistic unity. In the end, perhaps the Homeric question matters less than Homer's achievement. Whatever the precise circumstances of composition, the Iliad and Odyssey exist as magnificent works of art. They have moved audiences for nearly 3 millennia. They explore fundamental questions of human existence with unsurpassed power and beauty. Whether one genius or many created them, they represent the peak of ancient Greek achievement and deserve our admiration and study. And Chapter 9, The Poet's Legacy in Ancient Greece. Homer's influence on Greek civilization cannot be overstated. He was not merely a poet, but the fundamental educator, the shaper of Greek consciousness, the creator of a shared cultural foundation. To understand Greek civilization, one must understand Homer's role in creating and sustaining it. The Greeks themselves recognized Homer's unique position. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote that Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods, establishing the characteristics and relationships of deities. Plato called Homer the educator of Greece, while questioning whether such an educator taught the right lessons. Alexander the Great treasured his copy of the Iliad, seeing himself as a new Achilles living a Homeric destiny. Every educated Greek knew Homer intimately, could quote long passages, used Homeric references in daily conversation. In education, Homer was central. Boys learning to read used Homeric texts as primers. They memorized passages, analyzed grammar, studied vocabulary. The poems taught language, but also values, courage, honor, loyalty, proper behavior. Teachers used Homeric characters as moral examples. Achilles taught the danger of excessive pride. Hector showed love of family and duty. Odysseus demonstrated intelligence and perseverance. Negative examples also instructed: Agamemnon's poor leadership, Paris's cowardice, the suitor's abuse of hospitality. The poems also taught practical skills. Young aristocrats learned about warfare from Homer's battle scenes. They studied leadership through the council scenes, rhetoric through the speeches, diplomacy through the embassies. Homer provided a complete education in aristocratic values and skills. To be an aristocrat meant knowing Homer, embodying Homeric virtues, seeing oneself as heir to the heroes. Homer shaped Greek religious practice and belief. His portrayal of gods as anthropomorphic beings with human emotions and conflicts became the standard Greek conception. Temples were built to Homeric gods. Festivals celebrated events from the poems. Sacrifices followed procedures Homer described. Religious ceremonies included rhapsodic performances of Homeric hymns and epic passages. Poetry and religion were inseparable. The Iliad and Odyssey also provided Greeks with a shared history. Whether or not the Trojan War actually occurred as Homer described, Greeks believed it did. They traced their genealogies to Homeric heroes. Cities claimed foundation by returning warriors. The Trojan War became the defining event of Greek prehistory, the moment when Greek identity crystallized. Being Greek meant being heir to the Homeric heroes who had fought at Troy. Homer's influence extended to political thought. The poems depicted both monarchies and councils of warriors making collective decisions. They showed leaders accountable to their men, with poor leaders like Agamemnon criticized by common soldiers. This vision of qualified collective decision-making influenced the development of Greek democracy. The Athenian assembly, where citizens debated policy, had roots in Homeric council scenes. In literature, Homer was the unsurpassed master, the standard by which all other poetry was judged. Later Greek poets worked in Homer's shadow, either imitating his style or deliberately breaking from it. Tragedy drew plots from Homeric material. Aeschylus's tragedies about Agamemnon, Sophocles' Ajax, Euripides' Trojan women. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides structured their narratives using Homeric techniques. Philosophers from Pythagoras to Plato engaged with Homer, whether to praise or criticize. The poems also influenced Greek colonization, as Greeks spread across the Mediterranean, founding cities in Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and the Black Sea. They carried Homer with them. The poems provided cultural cohesion, reminding colonists of their Greek identity despite geographical separation. Homeric performances in colonial cities reinforced connections to the homeland. The wanderings of Odysseus became a map for Greek expansion, with various colonies claiming to be located at Homeric sites. Homer's portrayal of heroes shaped Greek ideals of masculinity. The Homeric hero was brave but not reckless, strong but also intelligent, competitive but capable of friendship. He valued honor above life, sought glory through noble deeds, accepted death with courage. This ideal influenced Greek behavior in countless situations, from athletic competitions to military campaigns. Men aspired to be like Homeric heroes, to earn similar fame, to be remembered in poetry and story. But Homer also provoked criticism and controversy. As Greek philosophy developed, thinkers questioned Homer's depiction of gods as immoral and capricious. Xenophanes complained that Homer made gods in humanity's image, attributing to them all human faults. Plato wanted to ban Homer from his ideal republic, arguing the poems taught bad lessons about gods and heroes. These criticisms testify to Homer's importance. He mattered enough to attack, his influence so pervasive that challenging him seemed necessary. Some defended Homer through allegorical interpretation. If the poems seemed to depict gods and heroes behaving badly, this must be symbolic, hiding deeper philosophical or moral truths. The affair of Ares and Aphrodite represented cosmic principles in conflict. Odysseus's wanderings symbolized the soul's journey through life. Allegorical reading allowed educated Greeks to continue revering Homer while incorporating philosophical sophistication. In visual arts, Homeric scenes dominated. Vase painters depicted key moments: Achilles and Hector's duel, Odysseus and the Sirens, Priam retrieving Hector's body. These images adorned everyday objects: drinking cups, oil jars, mixing bowls, surrounding Greeks with reminders of their shared cultural heritage. Wealthy patrons commissioned sculptures and mosaics of Homeric subjects. Temples displayed friezes showing Trojan War episodes. Homer's stories became a universal visual language. The Greek language itself was enriched by Homer. Countless phrases and epithets from the poems entered everyday speech. Rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, swift-footed. These Homeric expressions colored how Greeks described their world. Homer's vocabulary, his way of combining words, his metaphors, became part of Greek linguistic DNA, influencing how people thought and expressed themselves. Homer also gave Greeks a pan-Hellenic identity, transcending local loyalties. In a fragmented world of competing city-states, where Athens fought Sparta and Corinth competed with Thebes, Homer provided common ground. All Greeks were heirs to the heroes who fought at Troy. All worshipped the same Homeric gods. All shared the same cultural touchstones. This shared identity made possible institutions like the Olympic Games, pan-Hellenic festivals, and eventually political alliances against common enemies like Persia. Chapter 10. The Poet's Death and Immortality. Every story must end, and Homer's life, despite the greatness of his creations, reached its inevitable conclusion. The circumstances of his death are uncertain, veiled by time and legend, but ancient tradition preserved stories that may contain kernels of truth. Several ancient sources claim Homer died on the island of Ios in the Cyclades. According to legend, he was traveling by ship when he fell ill. Knowing death was near, he asked to be taken to Ios, where he died and was buried. The island later honored him with a tomb, becoming a pilgrimage site for those who revered the great poet. Other traditions place his death elsewhere, but Ios's claim was widely accepted in antiquity. One poignant story about Homer's death involves a riddle. According to tradition, Homer encountered some young fishermen on Ios who posed him a riddle he could not solve. What we caught, we threw away. What we could not catch, we kept. The answer was lice. The fishermen had caught fish but thrown them back, while the lice they failed to catch remained on their bodies. Homer, depressed by his inability to solve this simple riddle, supposedly died shortly after, killed by mortification that his great intellect had failed him in the end. This story is certainly apocryphal, but it reveals something true about how Greeks imagined Homer, as a man of supreme intelligence whose mind was his defining characteristic. The story also suggests a very human Homer, capable of pride and shame, vulnerable despite his genius. The greatest poet could still be humbled by a children's riddle, reminding us that all human achievement has limits. Homer probably died in old age, worn down by years of travel and performance, by the physical demands of a bard's life. Blindness and constant travel would have been exhausting. In an age when life expectancy was short and medicine primitive, reaching old age was itself an achievement. If Homer lived to 60 or 70, he would have been remarkably long-lived for his era. Perhaps his relatively sedentary occupation, sitting and reciting rather than laboring physically, allowed him unusual longevity. We can imagine his final days. Perhaps he was in the home of a patron, too weak to travel further. Perhaps students surrounded him, hoping to learn final wisdom from the master. Perhaps he recited passages from his own poems one last time, the words flowing from memory even as his body failed. Perhaps he spoke of poetry, of the importance of preserving stories, of the techniques he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Perhaps he simply closed his eyes and slept, slipping from sleep into death without drama or struggle. Homer left no written will, no instructions for his work's preservation. In an oral culture, such things were unnecessary. His poems lived in the memories of those who had heard them. His students would continue performing them. The tradition would endure, or so he must have hoped. He could not have known that his poems would be written down, translated, studied for thousands of years. He could not have imagined his influence on world literature. He was a poet doing what poets did, creating beautiful things and hoping they would outlive him. After his death, Homer's fame only grew. Cities competed to honor him. Chios, Smyrna, and Ios all claimed connection to him. Shrines were built, offerings made. He was venerated almost as a god, the divine poet who had given Greeks their cultural foundation. Annual festivals included performances of his works. Rhapsodes competed in Homeric recitation, with winners receiving prizes and honor. Homer's birthday, though unknown, was celebrated with ceremonies and sacrifices. But Homer's true immortality lay not in shrines or ceremonies, but in his words. The Iliad and Odyssey survived because they were too valuable to lose. They were memorized by generation after generation, performed in countless venues, eventually written down and copied onto papyrus and parchment. When libraries were founded at Alexandria and Pergamum, Homer's epics were among the first texts systematically collected and preserved. Scholars produced critical editions, wrote commentaries explaining difficult passages, compiled glossaries of Homeric vocabulary. The poems spread beyond Greece. As Greek culture expanded through Alexander's conquests and Roman adoption of Greek learning, Homer traveled to new audiences. Romans read Homer in Greek as part of their education. Latin translations and adaptations appeared. Virgil modeled his Aeneid on Homer's epics, creating a Roman counterpart to the Iliad and Odyssey. Through Rome, Homer reached Western Europe, influencing medieval and Renaissance literature. Yet there were periods when Homer nearly vanished from Western consciousness. The fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity changed European culture dramatically. Classical learning declined. Knowledge of Greek became rare in Western Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, Homer was known mainly through Latin adaptations and summaries, not in his original Greek. The Iliad and Odyssey survived in Byzantine libraries, but were largely unknown in the West. The Renaissance brought Homer's rediscovery. Greek scholars, fleeing the fall of Constantinople, brought manuscripts to Italy. Western scholars learned Greek again. New translations appeared in Latin and vernacular languages. Homer became accessible to European readers, inspiring artists and writers. The invention of printing ensured that Homer's texts, once preserved precariously in handwritten manuscripts, could be distributed widely and survive permanently. In the modern era, Homer has been translated into virtually every written language. The Iliad and Odyssey are read on every continent, studied in universities worldwide, adapted into countless forms: films, graphic novels, stage plays, operas. Characters created nearly 3 millennia ago remain alive in human consciousness. Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Penelope, their names are known, their stories told and retold. Scholars continue studying Homer, producing new editions, new translations, new interpretations. Archaeological discoveries provide context for understanding his world. Linguistic analysis reveals the structure of oral poetry. Literary criticism explores the poem's themes and artistry. Each generation finds new meanings in Homer's words, new relevance to contemporary concerns. The poems that entertained ancient Greeks still speak to modern readers about war and peace, home and exile, mortality and meaning. Homer's influence on literature is incalculable. Virtually every Western epic, from Virgil to Dante to Milton, owes debt to Homer. Novelists from Joyce to Walcott have reimagined Homeric stories. Poets across languages and centuries have imitated Homeric techniques or rebelled against them. To write in Western literary tradition means engaging with Homer, whether consciously or unconsciously. He is the fountainhead, the beginning, the standard against which all other epics are measured. But Homer's importance transcends literature. His poems ask fundamental questions. What makes life worth living? How should we face death? What do we owe each other? What is heroism? What is home? These questions are universal, and Homer's explorations of them remain profound nearly 3,000 years later. We may not worship Homer's gods or value the same kinds of honor, but we still struggle with mortality, identity, loyalty, and meaning. Homer speaks to these struggles with undiminished power. In death, Homer achieved what his heroes sought, immortal fame. His name has lasted 3 millennia and will likely last as long as humans tell stories. He has become a legend, a symbol of poetic genius, a reminder that individual human minds can create things that outlast kingdoms and empires. The blind bard who wandered Greek cities, reciting stories of ancient heroes, could not have known he was creating immortality for himself and for the characters he brought to life. Chapter 11. The Homeric Poems in Rome. Homer's influence extended far beyond Greece. When Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, Romans encountered Greek culture and were captivated by it. At the heart of that culture stood Homer, whose poems Romans embraced as enthusiastically as Greeks had, making the blind poet of Ionia a cornerstone of Roman education and literature. The Romans first encountered Homer through Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily, regions called Magna Graecia. As Roman power expanded, contact with Greek culture intensified. After conquering Greece itself in the 2nd century BCE, Rome found itself conquered culturally by its victim. As the poet Horace wrote, "Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror and brought the arts to rustic Latium." For educated Romans, learning Greek and reading Homer became essential marks of cultivation. The Iliad and Odyssey were studied alongside Latin texts, often even before them. Roman boys learned Greek specifically to read Homer in the original. Those who could not master Greek read him in Latin translation. The first significant work of Latin literature was Livius Andronicus's translation of the Odyssey, made in the 3rd century BCE. Though now lost, this translation shows how early and how profoundly Homer influenced Roman letters. Roman writers freely acknowledged their debt to Homer. Virgil, Rome's greatest poet, modeled his epic Aeneid on Homeric poems. The Aeneid's first half follows the Odyssey's pattern. Aeneas's wanderings after Troy's fall, his shipwrecks and adventures, his arrival in Italy. The second half echoes the Iliad, warfare in Italy, duels between heroes, divine intervention in battles. Virgil was not copying but engaging in creative dialogue with Homer, creating a Roman epic that honored while transforming its Greek model. Other Roman poets drew on Homer extensively. Ovid's Metamorphoses includes many Trojan War stories. Horace filled his odes with Homeric references. Lucan's Civil War epic consciously broke from Homeric conventions, showing Homer's influence even in rejection. Roman dramatists adapted Homeric material for the stage. The poems permeated Roman literature, providing plots, characters, and artistic standards. Roman education centered on Homer alongside Virgil. Grammatici, elementary teachers, used Homeric texts to teach Greek language and grammar. Rhetors, advanced teachers, taught rhetoric through analysis of Homeric speeches. Students memorized long passages, learned to parse complex syntax, studied figures of speech. Commentaries explained difficult passages, historical contexts, geographical references. An educated Roman knew Homer as thoroughly as an educated Greek. Roman philosophers engaged seriously with Homer. Stoics like Seneca found philosophical wisdom in the poems, reading them as teaching proper virtues despite their surface violence. Epicureans criticized Homer's anthropomorphic gods but admired his psychological insights. Neoplatonists like Porphyry and Proclus read Homer allegorically, finding profound metaphysical truths hidden in apparently simple stories. These philosophical appropriations showed Homer's continuing intellectual relevance. Roman military leaders invoked Homeric precedent. Julius Caesar compared his campaigns to ancient heroes' exploits. Roman generals saw themselves as heirs to Agamemnon or Achilles. Alexander the Great, though Greek-Macedonian, influenced Roman military culture, and Alexander had famously carried Homer's Iliad throughout his conquests, sleeping with it under his pillow. Roman commanders emulated this reverence for the martial epic. Ordinary Romans encountered Homer through public performances. Rhapsodes still performed the epics at festivals and games. Wealthy patrons hosted private recitations. Images from Homer adorned public buildings and private homes. Mosaics depicted Odysseus and the Sirens, Achilles and Hector. Frescoes showed scenes from Troy's fall. Homer's visual legacy spread throughout the Roman Empire, from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman skepticism also engaged with Homer. Historians like Livy questioned the accuracy of Homeric accounts of the Trojan War. Geographers tried to identify Odysseus's actual route, often with absurd results. Critics wondered whether Homer had actually existed or was a legendary figure. This skeptical tradition, questioning while respecting Homer, enriched Roman intellectual life. As Christianity rose to dominance in late antiquity, Homer's position became complicated. Christian intellectuals struggled with pagan literature. Should Christians read Homer, whose poems depicted false gods and celebrated martial values contrary to Christian ethics? Some church fathers condemned Homer. Others, like Basil and Gregory Nazianzen, argued that Homer could be read for literary excellence while rejecting his theology. This debate continued throughout late antiquity and the medieval period. Despite Christian reservations, Homer survived in the Byzantine East. Constantinople's libraries preserved Homeric manuscripts. Byzantine scholars produced commentaries and scholia, marginal notes explaining difficult passages. Byzantine education continued centering on Homer. While the Western Roman Empire fell and classical learning declined in Western Europe, the Byzantine East kept Homer alive, studying and copying his texts through a millennium. In the medieval West, direct knowledge of Homer largely disappeared. Few knew Greek. The Iliad and Odyssey were unavailable in Latin translation. Homer was known mainly through summaries and adaptations. The prose summaries of dictes and dares, supposedly eyewitness accounts of the Trojan War, medieval romances that transformed Homer's heroes into knights. The true Homer was lost, replaced by medieval fantasies of the ancient world. Yet even without direct access, medieval writers felt Homer's influence. The Trojan War story remained popular. Chaucer wrote Troilus and Chryseid, based on Homeric material filtered through medieval sources. Dante placed Homer in limbo with other righteous pagans, honoring him as the sovereign poet. Medieval literature, though not directly Homeric, inherited themes and structures from the tradition Homer founded. The Renaissance brought Homer's rediscovery in the West. Greek manuscripts reached Italy from Constantinople. Scholars learned Greek again. In 1488, the first printed edition of Homer appeared in Florence. New Latin translations followed, then translations into Italian, French, English. Western Europe rediscovered Homer, encountering the original texts after centuries of knowing him only through distorted medieval lenses. This rediscovery profoundly influenced Renaissance literature. Poets from Ariosto to Tasso to Spenser created epics inspired by Homer. Humanist scholars produced critical editions and commentaries. Homer became, once again, the foundational text of Western literary education. The recovery of Homer contributed to the Renaissance's revival of classical learning and its transformation of European culture. Chapter 12. Homer in the Modern World. The modern era has seen Homer's influence expand to truly global dimensions. His poems, once confined to the Greek and Roman worlds, now speak to humanity worldwide, translated into hundreds of languages, adapted into countless forms, remaining relevant after nearly 3 millennia. The Enlightenment brought new ways of reading Homer. Scholars approached the poems with critical rationalism, questioning traditional beliefs. Was Homer one poet or many? Did the Trojan War actually occur? How reliable was oral transmission? These questions, which we explored earlier as the Homeric question, fundamentally changed how educated people thought about Homer. He remained important, but as a subject of scholarly investigation rather than unquestioned authority. Translations proliferated in the 18th and 19th centuries. Each language received multiple Homer translations, often in different styles. Some translators aimed for literal accuracy, others for capturing Homer's spirit. Alexander Pope's English Iliad, 1715 to 1720, rendered Homer in heroic couplets, making him sound like an 18th-century English poet. Later translators preferred blank verse, free verse, or prose, each choice reflecting different ideas about how to make Homer accessible to modern readers. The Romantic movement embraced Homer enthusiastically. Romantic poets, rebelling against Enlightenment rationalism, celebrated Homer as a primitive genius, a natural poet whose work sprung directly from folk culture. They praised Homer's vivid imagery, powerful emotions, and connection to oral tradition. Goethe, Schiller, Keats, Byron all engaged deeply with Homer, finding in his poems inspiration for their own work. The 19th century brought archaeological discoveries that revolutionized understanding of Homer's world. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy and Mycenae in the 1870s revealed that Bronze Age civilizations matching Homer's descriptions had actually existed. Though Schliemann's methods were crude and his conclusions sometimes wrong, his discoveries proved Homer was not pure fiction, but preserved memories of real historical periods. This gave new credibility to the poems as historical sources, though careful scholars recognized that Homer's historicity was complex and limited. The 20th century saw unprecedented scholarly engagement with Homer. Milman Parry's work on oral poetry, which we discussed earlier, transformed understanding of how Homer composed. Linguistic analysis revealed the poem's complex relationship to Greek dialects. Archaeological discoveries continued, providing context for Bronze Age society. Literary criticism explored the poem's themes, structures, and artistry with sophisticated new methodologies. Homer became a subject of intense interdisciplinary study, examined from historical, linguistic, archaeological, anthropological, and literary perspectives. Modern translations of Homer show remarkable diversity. Some translators, like Richmond Lattimore and Robert Fagles, aimed for readable accuracy, creating versions that educated general readers could enjoy while remaining faithful to the original. Others, like Christopher Logue, freely adapted Homer, creating new works inspired by the epics. Stanley Lombardo produced versions that emphasized the poem's oral qualities, designed to be read aloud. Emily Wilson became the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English, bringing fresh perspective to a text long dominated by male translators. Homer has been adapted into virtually every artistic medium. Operas, ballets, films, television series, graphic novels, video games, all have drawn on Homeric material. Films like Troy, 2004, and O Brother, Where Art Thou, 2000, a modern Odyssey adaptation, brought Homer to audiences who might never read the poems. Some adaptations are faithful, others freely reimagine. All testify to the enduring power of Homer's stories and characters. Modern writers continue engaging with Homer creatively. James Joyce's Ulysses, 1922, reimagines the Odyssey in modern Dublin. Derek Walcott's Omeros, 1990, transposes Homeric themes to Caribbean context. Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad, 2005, retells the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective. Madeline Miller's novels explore Homeric characters in depth. These works show Homer's continuing relevance, his stories flexible enough to speak to contemporary concerns. Academia has institutionalized Homer. Classical studies programs worldwide center on Homeric texts. Students learn ancient Greek specifically to read Homer in the original. Scholarly journals publish hundreds of articles annually on Homeric topics. International conferences bring together specialists. Academic presses produce critical editions, commentaries, and scholarly monographs. Homer has become an academic industry, employing thousands of scholars and generating vast amounts of scholarship. Yet Homer also remains accessible to general readers. Modern translations are widely available and affordable. Public libraries stock Homer. Schools teach the poems, introducing new generations to Achilles and Odysseus. Book clubs discuss Homer alongside contemporary fiction. Online platforms offer free access to multiple translations. Homer is simultaneously a subject of specialized scholarship and a living part of popular culture. The digital age has created new ways of engaging with Homer. Websites provide searchable texts in multiple languages. Digital humanities projects analyze Homer using computational methods, tracking word frequencies, narrative patterns, formulaic systems. Online courses teach Homer to global audiences. Social media platforms share Homeric quotes and memes. Homer has entered cyberspace, finding new life in digital environments. Homer's themes remain strikingly relevant. War, displacement, homecoming, identity. These concerns resonate in our age of global conflict and mass migration. The Iliad's exploration of war's horror speaks to modern audiences who have witnessed mechanized warfare. The Odyssey's themes of exile and return resonate with refugee experiences. Homer's questions about heroism, loyalty, and meaning still challenge us. Modern scholarship has also raised important questions about Homer's limitations and biases. Feminist scholars note the poem's male-centered perspective, though some find complexity in female characters like Penelope and Andromache. Post-colonial critics examine how Homer's poems have been used to assert Western cultural superiority. These critiques do not diminish Homer's achievement, but contextualize it, showing how even masterpieces reflect their creators' societies and limitations. Homer has also influenced unexpected fields. Military academies use the Iliad to teach leadership and strategy. Psychologists draw on Homer for insights into trauma and grief. Philosophers continue finding ethical and metaphysical questions in the poems. Homer transcends literature, offering resources for thinking about fundamental human problems. Despite 3 millennia, Homer's poems have not grown stale. Each generation rediscovers them, finding new meanings, new applications, new reasons to care about ancient heroes. The poems survive not through institutional preservation alone, but through genuine artistic power. They remain worth reading not as relics, but as living literature that still moves, challenges, and enlightens. This is Homer's true immortality, not mere survival, but continuing vitality. Chapter 13. The Blind Seer's Vision. Let us return, in these final chapters, to the man himself. Who was Homer, stripped of legend and scholarly debate? What can we say about the human being behind the immortal poems? Though certainty is impossible, we can imagine a plausible portrait based on evidence from his works and ancient testimony. Homer was likely a man of keen intelligence, far above ordinary. His poems display profound understanding of human psychology, awareness of social and political complexity, knowledge of many subjects from warfare to seafaring to domestic life. He observed carefully, remembered extensively, thought deeply. His mind synthesized vast amounts of information into coherent artistic visions. His blindness, if we accept it as fact, shaped his art profoundly. Unable to see, Homer developed extraordinary auditory memory. He could remember thousands of lines of poetry, recall complex narrative structures, maintain consistency across long performances. His blindness enhanced certain abilities while limiting others. He could not describe visual beauty from personal experience, but could evoke it through others' descriptions and his own imagination. Homer's blindness may also have shaped his themes. Both the Iliad and Odyssey emphasize sight and its limitations. Characters misjudge situations, fail to recognize disguised identities, trust what they see when they should be skeptical. Perhaps Homer, lacking sight, understood better than most how little vision actually reveals, how much remains hidden, how easily appearance deceives. His blindness became insight, allowing him to see truths others missed. Homer was likely a man of strong emotions despite his blindness. His poems pulse with feeling, rage, grief, love, joy, despair. He understood passion deeply, could evoke emotional states with precision. Yet he also showed remarkable control, channeling emotion into structured art. This combination, deep feeling and artistic discipline, marks the greatest artists in any medium. Homer's wandering life gave him broad experience. He met people from many cities and social classes, observed different customs, heard diverse stories. This breadth informs his poems. His characters are not types, but individuals, each with distinct personality. His settings feel real because he knew many real places. His understanding of human nature transcends any single culture because he experienced human nature in its varieties. Yet Homer also knew the value of tradition. He worked within established forms, using inherited formulas, traditional stories, conventional themes. He was not a rebel destroying tradition, but a master perfecting it. He understood that innovation works best within structure, that freedom requires discipline, that originality emerges from mastery of convention. This balance between tradition and innovation, between received wisdom and personal vision, characterizes his approach. Homer was probably a man of competitive spirit. He lived in an agonal culture, where poets competed for recognition. His poems celebrate competition, athletic contests, rhetorical battles, struggles for glory. He understood the drive to excel, to be the best, to achieve immortal fame. Yet he also questioned competition's costs. Achilles gains glory through killing but loses friendship. Odysseus wins but returns to find his home invaded. Homer celebrated heroic ambition while showing its dark side. The poet was likely religious but not doctrinaire. His poems portray gods as powerful and worthy of respect, but also flawed and morally questionable. He shows piety as important, but also shows the gods acting capriciously. His religion seems pragmatic. Honor the gods because they have power, but don't expect perfect justice from them. This balanced view, respecting divine power while recognizing divine limitations, allowed his poems to appeal to both believers and skeptics. Homer understood mortality deeply. Both poems meditate on death, inevitable, impartial, final. Heroes seek glory because they know they will die. Achilles chooses short life with fame over long life in obscurity. Hector dies defending his city, knowing he cannot win. Odysseus's journey is a journey back to mortal life, refusing immortality to be human in his own home. Homer, perhaps feeling his own mortality as an aging blind man, explored what makes mortal life meaningful despite its brevity. The poet also understood the importance of storytelling itself. Characters in his poems tell stories constantly. Odysseus narrates his adventures, bards perform in palaces, memories are preserved through tales. Homer knew he was a storyteller, and he understood storytelling's power to preserve, to teach, to entertain, to give meaning. His poems are meta-narratives, stories about the importance of stories. He was writing himself into immortality while reflecting on that very act. Homer was probably a lonely man. His profession required constant travel, temporary relationships, performance for strangers. His blindness made him dependent on others, unable to function independently. His genius might have isolated him further. Extraordinary minds often struggle to connect with ordinary ones. Yet his poems show deep understanding of friendship, love, loyalty. Perhaps his loneliness made him value connection more, helping him portray human relationships with such power. The poet understood the tension between civilization and barbarism. His poems constantly explore this boundary: Greeks versus Trojans, Odysseus versus Cyclopes, law versus chaos. He shows civilization's value while acknowledging its costs. Civilized people can be cruel. Barbarous people can be noble. The Trojans, enemies of Greece, are portrayed as human and sympathetic. The suitors, Greeks in a Greek palace, are brutal and deserve death. Homer rejected simple binaries, understanding that civilization and barbarism exist in all societies and individuals. Homer was also aware of class differences. His poems depict aristocrats primarily, but include slaves, servants, and common people. He shows how the poor suffer from aristocratic wars, how servants enable noble luxury. While he celebrates aristocratic values, he also questions them. Is Achilles' honor worth so many deaths? Do the suitors' noble birth excuse their behavior? These questions suggest Homer, while working for aristocratic patrons, maintained critical distance from their worldview. Finally, Homer was a craftsman who loved his art. Every line of his poems shows care, skill, attention to detail. He worked and reworked his material, perfecting rhythm, selecting precise words, balancing sound and meaning. He was not inspired in the sense of unconsciously channeling divine voice, but in the sense of being deeply committed to his craft, driven to create the best possible poetry. His genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, or rather, endless performance and refinement. This, then, is Homer, intelligent, emotionally deep, widely experienced, masterful in his craft, competitive yet thoughtful, religious but questioning, aware of mortality, valuing connection, critical of social hierarchies while working within them, and above all, committed to creating the best possible poetry. He was a remarkable human being whose works reflect his remarkable mind and character. Chapter 14. The Timeless Questions. Homer's poems have survived nearly 3 millennia because they address questions that never stop mattering. Each generation finds new relevance in texts composed thousands of years ago because Homer explored fundamental aspects of human existence. Let us consider the timeless questions his works engage. What is heroism? The Iliad presents multiple models: Achilles' supremacy in battle, Hector's defense of family and city, Odysseus' cunning intelligence, Ajax's straightforward courage. No single definition emerges. Homer shows heroism's complexity, its costs and contradictions. Heroes achieve glory, but often die young. They protect their communities, but also endanger them. Heroic codes demand behaviors that cause suffering. These complications make Homer's exploration of heroism profound, rather than simplistic. How should we face mortality? Death permeates Homer's poems. Warriors die constantly in the Iliad. Odysseus visits the underworld and sees the grim reality of death. Yet characters respond differently to mortality. Achilles chooses short, glorious life over long, obscure one. Hector fights, though fated to die. Odysseus refuses immortality to return home mortal. Homer presents mortality as the fundamental human condition, but shows various ways of facing it. There is no single answer, only different paths to meaning. What do we owe each other? Homer's poems explore obligations between friends, family members, hosts and guests, leaders and followers, allies and enemies. These obligations often conflict. Achilles owes loyalty to the Greek army, but also to his own honor. Odysseus owes fidelity to his wife, but also politeness to divine hosts. Hector owes duty to Troy, but also love to his family. Homer shows ethical life as navigation among competing obligations, with no easy solutions, but real consequences for choices made. What is home, and why does it matter? The Odyssey centers on homecoming, but Homer explores what home means. Is it a physical place? Ithaca's cliffs and halls? Is it family, Penelope and Telemachus? Is it identity, being Odysseus, king and husband? Is it social position, restoration of proper order? Homer suggests home is all these things, making homecoming complex. Odysseus must reclaim not just a place, but his entire life. The poem asks, what makes any place home, and why do we long for it? How do we maintain identity through change? Odysseus returns from war after 20 years, aged and transformed by experience. Penelope has spent 20 years waiting, changed by time and hardship. Can they still be the same people? Can their relationship survive such transformation? Homer suggests identity is both continuous and evolving. Odysseus is still himself, but also different. The challenge is recognizing continuity while acknowledging change. What is justice? Both poems wrestle with this question. Is justice revenge, as Achilles believes when he slaughters Trojans for killing Patroclus? Is justice honor, as Agamemnon claims when he takes Briseis? Is justice restoration of order, as Odysseus achieves by killing suitors. Homer presents multiple concepts of justice, showing how they conflict. He provides no simple answer, but forces readers to think deeply about justice's nature and limitations. How should we relate to divine power? Homer's gods are powerful, but morally questionable. They help favorites, but also harm innocents. They demand worship, but offer no guarantee of protection. Characters respond variously, with piety, cynicism, manipulation, resignation. Homer suggests that divine power must be acknowledged and respected, but also that mortals should not expect perfect justice from gods. Religious belief and religious skepticism coexist in his works. What is the relationship between individual and community? Heroes are individuals with personal desires and ambitions, but they also belong to communities with collective needs. These can conflict profoundly. Achilles' individual honor leads him to withdraw from battle, endangering all Greeks. Hector's duty to Troy requires him to face certain death. Odysseus's desire to return home means abandoning companions. Homer shows the tension between individual freedom and social obligation as permanent and unresolvable. How do we cope with trauma? Homer's works are full of traumatic events: death, loss, violation, enslavement, war's horrors. Characters cope variously: through rage, Achilles; through endurance, Odysseus; through grief, Priam; through cunning, Penelope. Homer does not prescribe a single path through trauma, but shows different survival strategies, acknowledging that trauma transforms people permanently. There is no return to innocence, only movement forward bearing scars. What role should emotion play in our lives? Homer's characters are intensely emotional. They rage, grieve, love, fear. Yet they also must control emotions to function and survive. The poems explore the balance between feeling deeply and acting rationally. Achilles' uncontrolled rage destroys him. Odysseus's controlled emotions enable survival. Homer suggests that emotion is essential to humanity, but must be balanced with reason and self-control. What is the meaning of suffering? Both poems contain tremendous suffering: war's destruction, journey's hardships, grief's pain. Characters and audiences must make sense of this suffering. Is it punishment for sin, bad luck, fate, divine whim, character flaws, consequence? Homer suggests suffering often has no clear meaning or purpose. It simply is part of existence, to be endured rather than explained away. This honest acknowledgement of suffering's presence without easy theodicy makes Homer profound. How should we remember the past? Both poems are acts of memory, preserving events for future generations. But memory is complicated. Homer shows how the past is used and misused, how memory can inspire or paralyze, how we shape the past to serve present needs. The poems themselves are memory artifacts, asking, what should be remembered? How should it be told? What lessons should be drawn? These questions remain urgent in any age. What makes life worth living? Despite, or because of, mortality, suffering, conflict, and uncertainty, Homer's characters find life worth living. They seek glory, love, home, justice, meaning. They value friendship, family, honor, courage. They create and appreciate beauty, song, craft, eloquence, physical excellence. Homer suggests life's worth emerges not from eternal happiness, but from engagement with challenges, from connections with others, from creating meaning in a universe that offers none inherently. These questions have no final answers. Each reader, each generation must grapple with them anew. This is why Homer survives, not because he provides answers, but because he asks the right questions, the questions that matter, the questions that make us human. His poems are not solutions, but invitations to think deeply about how to live. Chapter 15, The Eternal Song. As we conclude this journey through Homer's life and legacy, we must acknowledge a paradox. We have spent hours discussing a man about whom we know almost nothing with certainty. We do not know when he was born or when he died, whether he was blind, where he lived, or even whether he existed as a single historical individual. Yet we have talked as if we knew him, and in a sense, we do. We know Homer through his works. The Iliad and Odyssey, whatever their precise origins, reveal a mind of extraordinary power and sensitivity. The poet who created these works, whether one person or several, whether named Homer or something else, understood human nature profoundly. He knew how people think, feel, and behave. He could imagine complex characters and intricate situations. He could structure vast narratives with coherence and purpose. He could write lines that move hearts after 3,000 years. This Homer, the Homer of the poems rather than the possibly fictional biography, is the one who truly matters. The historical details, fascinating as they are, ultimately matter less than the artistic achievement. Whether Homer was born in Smyrna or Chios, whether he lived 70 years or 50, whether he was completely blind or merely visually impaired, these facts would be interesting to know, but would not change what his poems accomplish. The works transcend their creator's biography, standing independent of historical circumstances. Yet the biographical details we have discussed, even if partly legendary, serve a purpose. They help us imagine the human being behind the poems. They remind us that these masterpieces were created by someone, some person, who lived and struggled and perfected his craft. The image of the blind wandering poet, reciting from memory, depending on others' kindness, creating beauty through words. This image has power, whether historically accurate or not. It represents the artistic vocation in its purest form, the creator who transforms suffering and limitation into transcendent art. Homer's legacy is not merely literary, but cultural and ethical. His poems shaped Greek civilization, gave it common stories and values, helped create a shared identity that transcended political divisions. Through Greek civilization, Homer influenced Roman culture. Through Rome, he influenced medieval and Renaissance Europe. Through Europe, he influenced the entire world. The threads connecting Homer to contemporary global culture are too numerous to count. We live in a world shaped in small but real ways by a blind poet who lived almost 3,000 years ago. But Homer's influence is not just historical. His poems remain living texts, read and reread by millions. They are taught in schools, performed in theaters, adapted into films, discussed in book clubs, analyzed in universities. Each year, thousands of people encounter Homer for the first time, meeting Achilles and Odysseus, experiencing the Trojan War and the journey home. For these readers, Homer is not a distant historical figure, but an immediate presence, a voice speaking across centuries directly to them. What do modern readers find in Homer? Often, recognition. Despite the poem's antiquity, the characters feel real. Their emotions are familiar: anger, grief, love, fear, joy. Their situations, though set in mythical past, reflect universal human experiences. War separates families. Journeys test endurance. Home calls to exiles. Pride leads to destruction. Intelligence enables survival. These patterns transcend time and culture. Homer speaks to something fundamental in human nature. Modern readers also find beauty. Homer's language, even in translation, has power. His similes comparing warriors to lions and storms to chaos remain vivid. His descriptions of dawn and sea and battle still move us. His characters' speeches, whether pleading for mercy or boasting before combat, still ring true. The poems are aesthetic achievements, creating pleasure through language's skillful use. This beauty is reason enough to read Homer, beyond any educational or cultural value. The poems also offer complexity. Homer does not simplify human experience or moral questions. His heroes are flawed. His gods are questionable. His war is simultaneously glorious and horrible. His homecoming is triumphant, but also violent. These ambiguities make the poems mature works that reward rereading. Each encounter reveals new layers, new complications, new insights. Homer does not preach, but presents, allowing readers to form their own judgments. Homer also provides historical and cultural education. Reading his poems, we glimpse ancient Greek values and worldviews. We learn how ancient peoples thought about gods, heroes, honor, fate. We see a society organized around warrior aristocracy, where personal glory mattered intensely, where shame was worse than death. This education in cultural difference is valuable, reminding us that human societies can organize themselves very differently while remaining recognizably human. But perhaps Homer's greatest gift is showing us that beauty and meaning can emerge from suffering and limitation. Homer himself, blind and dependent, wandering and uncertain, created immortal beauty from his constraints. His characters, facing death and loss, find glory and purpose. His poems, born from oral tradition's limitations, achieved perfection within those limits. This is an endlessly inspiring message, that circumstances do not determine outcomes, that humans can transcend limitations through courage and creativity, that meaning can be wrought even from suffering. The eternal song continues. Somewhere tonight, someone will open the Iliad for the first time, meeting swift-footed Achilles and godlike Hector. Somewhere, a student will puzzle over ancient Greek, trying to hear Homer's original rhythms. Somewhere a scholar will publish a new interpretation, adding to the vast conversation about these poems. Somewhere an artist will create a new adaptation, reimagining Homer for contemporary audiences. The tradition lives because the poems live, because they continue speaking to human hearts and minds. We began this journey asking who Homer was. We end realizing that the question has no complete answer, but also that it does not need one. Homer is his poems. He is the voice speaking through the Iliad and Odyssey. He is the mind behind those works. He is the tradition culminating in those texts. He is every reader's experience of those poems. He is the cultural force those works unleashed. He is all these things and more. The blind poet who may or may not have lived, who may or may not have composed both epics, who definitely created or finalized works of unsurpassed beauty and profundity. This poet lives. Homer lives in his poems. He lives in his influence. He lives in every reader who encounters his works and finds them speaking to the deepest questions of existence. He lives in the eternal questions his poems pose. How should we live? How should we face death? What gives life meaning? What is home? What is heroism? What is justice? As long as humans ask these questions, Homer will live. As long as people seek beauty and meaning in language, his poems will endure. The eternal song, once sung by a blind bard in ancient Ionia, continues echoing through time, finding new audiences, inspiring new creations, speaking truths that age cannot diminish. This is Homer's immortality, not mere survival but endless vitality, not preservation but continuing life. And now, Dear listener, our journey ends where it began, with mystery and wonder. We have imagined a life for Homer, traced his influence, explored his art. But the man himself remains elusive, hidden behind his works, known only through what he created. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps poets should be mysterious, known primarily through their art rather than their biographies. Perhaps Homer's elusiveness is part of his magic, allowing each generation to reimagine him, to find in him what they need. Rest now, and let Homer's words echo in your dreams. May you dream of bronze-armed warriors and wine-dark seas, of homecomings and farewells, of gods and heroes, and the eternal human struggle to create meaning in a mortal world. May Homer's eternal song lull you to peaceful sleep, and may you wake refreshed, ready to face your own Odyssey through life.